You never know the day before you're going to decide to recover. And stripping people of that possibility through the power of suggestibility, through professionals that are supposed to be taking care of them, is unconscionable. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Uncovery Podcast. My name is Maddie and I recovered from anorexia, and I talk about that and other topics on this podcast. Now, you are, if you are watching YouTube, not actually watching my face, which is because this is an audio only episode due to the fact that the actual interview recordings on video were corrupted in my camera. So this is going to be audio only, but the secret benefit of that is I hope that you can intently hear what we talk about on this episode. I think it's an important one. Now, I don't typically believe in trigger warnings, especially as they pertain to eating disorders, and you can hear more about that on previous episodes of this podcast. However, this is going to be the sort of 0.01% of cases where I think it's important to just notify you off the top that the topic matter that we have at hand this week has to do with medical assistance in dying. It has to do with assisted suicide, aka euthanasia. And so it gets a little bit intense. I get a little bit heated in the episode. And as I was listening back and editing it, I was thinking, wow, Maddie, do you maybe need to calm down about this? And perhaps, but I also feel really passionately about my position on this. That said, I also am willing to interrogate my own positions on an ongoing basis. And so that's something that I'm willing to do in this context as well. But we have done a good chunk of evidence gathering in support of the conversation that Lakshmi and I had on this episode. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to myself and Lakshmi in the past. And please hear us. And I hope that you enjoy as much as it is possible to enjoy an episode around this topic. So thanks for listening. Lakshmi, welcome back to the Uncovery Podcast.
Thank you, Maddie. I'm happy to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. I wish the topic that we were discussing was more positive than the way I perceive it to be, but the context under which we wanted to have this conversation is something that I had seen. I think it was in the summer that I saw the news about this come out. And I remember just immediately weeping, just immediately crying about it as I was reading an article. And it was the announcement of the policy change in the medical assistance in dying policy here in Canada that will now include anorexic patients, and specifically severely enduring anorexic patients and eating disorders. And I find this incredibly distressing, and I've been thinking about it ever since, and we've been talking about it ever since. And now we're having a formal discussion about it. And so tell me, first of all, what your gut reaction is when we talk about the Medical Assistance in Dying Act as it pertains to people with anorexia.
My gut reaction was alarm. And a lot of questions, because when you say discussion, I was thinking it is actually a discussion. And inside that discussion are many points that the layperson does not understand. So when I think about the treatment of, we can say anorexia, but we're also saying all eating disorders, but mostly anorexia. And the paper that came out refers to 3 people who had anorexia and OCD, which is a very difficult combination. So I appreciate that it's a very difficult combination for the client as well as for the people who are working with them. But still, I felt alarmed because I had a bunch of questions come into my mind. How is this decision made? Who is making this decision? And just about what I know about the recovery of eating disorders. So I'm a great proponent of people can recover from an eating disorder. And I say it over and over, not to convince myself, but in a said with weight, said with weight. This is possible, not in an airy-fairy way, not in a hopeful way, hope without feet on the ground. It's hope that has feet on the ground. And it's not just hope, there is intention and then action. And there is a lot of, as we know, back and forth steps. To me as a therapist, and this is also to families, the concept of holding space. The other day, one of my clients said, what does that mean, holding space, right? Holding space for the person to face their fears of recovery, to give up behaviors of recovery. So I had alarm about when is the suggestion made to a client that you are one of those unfortunate people who have severely enduring eating disorder, which kind of implies, unfortunately, you might not recover like some other people. And the language of rights, you have a right to, which kind of, for me, becomes a little distracting. Suddenly we're talking about rights as opposed to saying, taking away the hope of recovery, right?
Yeah.
So,
and we'll get, I think we'll get into like the rights part of it and the way that we kind of feel about that. But your immediate gut reaction of alarm is, I think, accurate. And I think many of us in the recovery space, at least I would hope, have the same feeling.
Yeah.
For me, the alarm and the real reason that it concerned me so deeply and so personally is that I believe that there have been multiple points in my life and in my recovery journey, call it, that I would have been considered severely enduring.
Yes.
And indeed, when I have been in certain programs, they have bridged the conversation with me about, at that time, MAID wasn't an option.
Yeah.
But this thing that we call harm reduction, this thing that we call living with your eating disorder in your life and sort of just getting by and like managing to live, because we just don't think that you're going to recover and we just don't think that you're going to let go of your eating disorder. So how can we allow you to basically keep your eating disorder while still functioning in society? Where can we give you those tools? That's been proposed to me as a person with an eating disorder by a treatment professional. And so what my mind went to when I thought about this is, this would be me.
Yep.
And they would have said, hey, we don't know that you can really recover. Have you considered dying? That's deeply disturbing to me as a person that then went on to recover and knowing so deeply in my soul that this is 100% possible.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this would have been suggested to you, say, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, not knowing that something would turn the corner, right? Something would make a difference.
It's one of these things where when we make policy and we decide that it should be evidence-based policy, or we like to pretend, a lot of government bodies and public policymakers like to pretend that they're doing evidence-based policy, that they have things that they are working towards, that they have made an impact in a positive way. But they're not doing that with evidence, in my opinion, because the evidence that they're using is completely flawed. The evidence is coming from people that are deeply, deeply unwell, and there are ethical and moral implications for including people with mental illnesses in things such as medical assistance in dying. Because who is to decide, as you brought up earlier?
Well, yes. And I will say, yes, do we need evidence and repeatability? And I'm going to say in science, yes. Sometimes the crossovers are not paid attention to. So we cross over from medical science to mental health, but we cross over casually. Sometimes heavy statements are made casually. So the article in The Guardian about Dr. Gaudiani, and there was a picture and there was an article. But as somebody who works with eating disorders, I read that article. And the person who writes that article at one point says, treatment has not really advanced in the last 150 years. And that bothers me because I'm like, it has. So
of course
much.
It has. Of course it has.
So much. Like they did not understand what it was. The doctors came in. They separated the families from the patient initially because psychology was in its babyhood. Then psychology advances. It was a medical model till I'm going to say the 70s, the 80s, Karen Carpenter and all of that. Psychology starts, catching up with attachment theory and with family systems. And psychology takes an equal seat at the table with the medical people. Now, we'll get to this later. Sometimes that seat is not equal, right? So when I think about the rounds table at a program, and there is a psychiatrist and a therapist and an occupational therapist and a physician and a dietitian, everybody sitting around the table, and everyone has a role to play. But sometimes, statements are made lightly, and they are terribly inaccurate. They are made by the wrong people. Sometimes a statement is repeated over and over. So the way is, the manualized models, right? CBT is evidence-based and DBT is evidence-based. I don't disagree that it is, but you cannot put everything into a column and a box. So, but if you repeat it enough, when you understand that that's the way to the exclusion of any other way. And as far as I'm concerned, eating disorders require extremely creative treatment. Evidence-based is a term that's used very widely. And I think, in my opinion, people throw in the word evidence-based for credibility. We know that this is evidence-based. In the treatment of eating disorders, after my 15 years of experience, it requires one to be very creative. But creativity cannot be put in a box, right? There is a lot of flexibility and agility I require to work with somebody and to understand what's going on. And there is context to a client. There is context to the illness. There is context in the way I understand it as a therapist, which does not really fit into a box.
I think this is also part of what I find really disturbing about this is that, to me, in my gut, it feels like a cop-out. It feels like a total cop-out of the willingness to support, to fund, to see through recovery for clients in what is an incredibly complex mental and therefore physical illness. And rather than saying this is complex and we can hold that complexity and we can address that complexity and we can use evidence in doing so, instead it is we're throwing our hands up and saying, it's a lot, it's beyond hope, and honestly, we don't really think that they're going to get better. Look at all these statistics. Look at how rare it is for someone to really recover. Maybe they're just better off.
I think it's understood as being merciful. So I think the person who is proposing it is saying as these people, though when I read the paper, all of the patients say, I don't really want to die. My life is just so miserable.
We need to linger there for a minute.
Yes.
That there are very limited numbers of cases that they're actually pointing to in the writings about this as justification for moving this into policy, first of all. And even those individuals are not saying, I want to die. They are not saying they want to die. And that should have been all that anybody needed to hear to say, we can help these people. They actually don't want to die.
Yes, but as a treatment person, if I don't know what I don't know, right? If I have hit my limits. So this is something we don't talk about. We talk about the illness. We talk about the illness without much detail. We say eating disorders are complex and there might be something underlying, but we don't actually step into or lean into explaining the complexity. We kind of say it's complex. Sometimes I find that saying it's complex is a cop-out. It's too complex to explain. Mm-hmm. We kind of need Einstein, otherwise, so there is that piece. Then there is the client. And then there is the treatment team or who is calling it. The treatment team, I'm going to say when I read these papers and all of it, is not much talked about. The limitations of treatment programs, the limitations of therapists, the limitations of the treatment folks.
The professionals, basically, the treatment professionals. There's such a range.
Spoken about or thought about. And that is something we'll talk about, like who makes the decision, because this is a mental health illness. It is not actually a medical illness. It's a mental health illness with medical presentation.
And ramifications, yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And yes, sometimes people, are medically very unwell for a period of time. But in that period of time, again, this is something we'll talk about, the power of suggestion. If I walk into the room and I'm a trusted professional in that vulnerable state, it depends on which way I am leaning. Am I going to say, Maddie, you can actually recover. It takes time. It is hard, but you can recover. Or I say, Maddie, you have a diagnosis of severely enduring anorexia. So you just need to know this is an option. You have the right to die.
Let's linger here for 1 second before we dive into the power of suggestion, the role of hope, what we should actually be doing instead of killing anorexics. I want to linger on severely enduring eating disorders. Like, where does this even come from? What does that even mean? And do we know enough about that to make some kind of claim about what should be done in those cases?
I think it comes from the world of the comfort of diagnosis. Diagnosis is important to an extent, because as a professional, I'm going to say as a therapist, I cannot afford to get rigid about diagnosis. Because as we know, eating disorders, it morphs, it shapeshifts. So sometimes I have a client coming and saying, I have anorexia and bulimia. But what they're actually saying is they were restricting for a long time, and then the body kind of could not do that anymore. So they they found themselves eating more food, which they call binging, and then throwing up to compensate.
Which then they call bulimia.
Either way, as the person working with that person, I know that they are still struggling with the numbers and with the compensation and the substitution and the balancing, which is the hallmark of an eating disorder. And underlying, they are still struggling with, if I am small enough, I will be safe enough.
So our fixation with, we need to label these things, we feel comfort as professionals, as society, when we can put things in boxes. And fair enough, we're not great at complexity. It takes up a lot of cognitive resources. So for us to be able to say, oh, tick, 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 you fall in this box, tick, 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 you fall in this box. And then what do we do about that feels to us more clear.
I think it comes from the medical world. That's as simple as it is.
It's a medicalization of a mental illness.
Medically. So when I say medically, physicians and psychiatrists are trained through diagnosis. So I don't know, that's their training. That is not my training as a therapist.
Yeah.
I don't have the luxury of putting somebody into a box. I don't prescribe medication.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't have any reliance on a pill. I have to do it. Pills have their value. I am not one of those people who say it doesn't matter what, willpower and hope. No, pills have their role, and they take the edge off. In the case of anxiety and depression, they help. And then my therapy can stand on the shoulders of what that pill offers, no doubt. But I have to do more. I have to do more. For instance, I had a client who severe anorexia. She went to all the treatment places in the US. So I did not have the option to send her somewhere again. She had tried it all. So I had to work with her in the community. After about, I'm going to tell you 4 years maybe of me sitting with her, holding space, working. She is now in university, beginning to live her life, stepping out of that closed, tiny space. And I can say that as anorexia, or I can say that as the way her life was, but stepping out.
Yeah.
I have to have the whatever it takes to hold space, to wait, to continue working. This is somebody who could have 100% been diagnosed as severely enduring anorexia. We put her in a box, and then we offer her the right to die.
Yeah. And it's this severely enduring eating disorder thing is so blanket and doesn't give any room to the nuances of any one individual's profile, history, context, etc. And so to just kind of close that loop, it's a diagnosis of essentially you've had this for a certain amount of time. We've qualified it as severe. So that gives you your enduring, that gives you your severe, and you have an eating disorder. So that's how we wrap you up in this bow. And it's sort of this like dark mark or this big red flag around you of like, beyond hope. Beyond hope,
yeah.
We don't believe that
yeah.
you are able to recover. And so moving into kind of discussing hope
yeah.
and the role of hope, a therapist, what is your role in providing hope to those who undoubtedly, and as somebody who's been there, can say very confidently, we don't believe that we can get better either. We don't. Now the medical system doesn't. Now policymakers don't believe we can get better. What does that do for my hope? Not a lot. And it wasn't very high to begin with because I think that I'm beyond help at a certain point in my eating disorder.
So, I mean, I've said this in another podcast. I came into the world of eating disorders by accident. I was looking for a family counselor job. I got it in the eating disorder program, and there I was. And it was a steep learning curve. So all my learning has been sitting with somebody, and they tell me an enigmatic sentence. And I'm like, what does that mean? You know, how does that sentence make meaning? Even when someone says, I hate myself, it is not a straightforward sentence. It has meaning. I'm curious about it. It doesn't simply mean I hate myself. The person is actually saying, I have not learned how to live in my adult body with ease. That is what they're saying. I hate the feelings that I feel in my body because I don't know how to negotiate them. That is my job as a therapist, to interpret the meaning of it. And the client who is saying it says, yeah, that's actually what I mean. But they wouldn't have been able to tell me that. They wouldn't have been able to say, I did not learn how to negotiate my feelings in my body that was changing into an adult body. And so I have not grown into ease into my adult body. And I have been struggling since I was 16 years old when I developed BRAS, or, you know, a young man would say something else. And I have been struggling with this. That is my job.
Yeah.
And that is, as soon as I say it and we find some agreement, now we have something to work on.
And the therapist's role, you're essentially a professional dot connector and intuitive is what it is.
Yes.
Because you're picking up these pieces of data that your client is giving you day over day, week over week, saying, this is how I feel, this is how I feel. And there's these platitudes and these overly simplified sentences and these raw feelings. And you're putting all that together in this constellation and saying, do you mean to say...
Yes.
And presenting and reflecting it back to them so that then they can make meaning of their experience.
And I want to say something else. That interpretation is not my intuition. I really want to emphasize this. It is standing on a solid foundation of theory. It is not, you know, yes, there is some interpretation that I like languages and I'm good with words, and that is my contribution. And one of the things we want to know about eating disorders is it is the most indirect way of asking for help. Mm-hmm. You know, I am not going to. So sometimes when I work with small children, I explain to parents, babies start out asking for help directly. And then, you know, they come to us and they say things and they ask for help. They cry. But as time goes on, small children learn not to ask for help directly for one reason or another. Within each family system, it has its own story. So I cannot exclude the family system from when I'm working with somebody.
Yeah.
And to understand that person. Mm-hmm. So the landscape we're talking about is pretty complicated. It's not something you can put in a box.
It's not something that you can put in a box. And what you said before about it also being grounded in theory, I think is actually a really, really important point to make, because people in this discussion, people could reflect and be like, yes, well, there's different levels of therapists, or there are higher qualified or higher quality therapists, and they have these magical abilities and intuition and all of this stuff. And some people have higher intuition and better abilities to co-regulate with people. They're better at what they do in that energetic space. However, all of this theory of how we deliver therapy in a way that is meaningful to people suffering with eating disorders in such a way that they can and will recover is grounded in theory, is measurable, and is trainable.
Yes.
And people can do it. Whether or not therapists are less successful now, they could be more successful. So we don't have to have these magical unicorn therapists necessarily in order to solve every single eating disorder that we have, because those resources are limited. But we can train using sound theory the ability to actually walk people out of eating disorders. But the therapists have to believe that that's possible.
And life experience.
Yeah.
Right? It's a combination of all of it. So sometimes I'm working with a 17-year-old who is in a really bad place, and I tell the parents, we're going to hold space while her brain matures, right? It's not just intelligence. It's not just physical capacity, she's undernourished, so she cannot think. It brings us to the concept of sound mind. So when I think about sound mind and how decisions are made, when in my therapeutic process with somebody, I might have a 40-year-old client who, as far as the eating disorder is concerned, and when we say eating disorder, I can interchangeably say eating disorder or anxiety. There are a few things you think about when you're working with somebody, which is just IQ, plain intelligence. Physically, are they well enough? But I have to say, it's not often I meet somebody who cannot think. People can think quite when their body is quite depleted, they are still able to think, but they are in distress, right? So we're not making big decisions when somebody is in that much distress. We're just at that point thinking about the next meal. The other thing I think about as a therapist is developmental stages. So mistaking someone who's 40 years old to have the emotional maturity of 40. And in the medical world, I'm going to tell you, probably emotional maturity is not something that doctors are thinking about. They might be faced with it. They might not know what to do with it. But there is actually a growing up process that has been stunted that I, as a therapist, have to attend to. Catching up the parts of you to that 40-year-old place.
It's so important in this context because we are expecting people to make sound decisions for themselves and for their future, or cutting their future short, in a brain that is not only malnourished and devoid of glucose, but is also developmentally, emotionally stuck wherever it was that their eating disorder basically started. And then we're asking them to make the most important decision that they have ever made under those conditions, because we're relying on what appears to be sound mind, which is what we would consider some kind of high functioning person that's able to have a conversation and communicate to us that this is indeed what they want, or that they can be eloquent. It is almost a crowning characteristic of people with eating disorders and anorexia that they come across as extremely accomplished and high functioning and smart and clever and eloquent. We're great at that. But that fools everybody into thinking that we know what the hell that we're doing. And we don't. We're completely lost and completely devoid of common sense.
We know that, I look at you, Maddie, and I'm smiling because under that confident facade is somebody who will probably agree with me if our relationship is good enough, right? Right? There is this thing of, I have to say yes or no. So I'm a professional you trust. I come along and I say, Maddie, unfortunately, there is this thing, severely enduring anorexia, and you are one of those people. It's really unfortunate, but that's a fact. And you should know one of your options is, medically assisted suicide. Now, Maddie, who feels that she's a burden to everybody in her life, and, Lakshmi, who she trusts very much, is kind of saying that you have a possibility of opting out and not bothering anybody anymore with the misery of your existence. The power of suggestion is so huge.
It's so huge. It's so huge because in so many cases, the only person that someone has that's going through this is their professional treatment team, individuals within that constellation of treatment teams, whether that's the medical doctor, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, the dietitian, the therapist, whoever it is. Those are the only places that some of us feel we have to go for a lot of our recovery. And it becomes gospel. Whatever you tell me, I will believe you because I have nothing else to go on.
Yes. And I want to make the distinction between, this is not a matter of love, right? This is not a matter of love, and it is not a matter of mercy. So families love the client, and the client loves their families. And every single eating disorder client will tell me they do not want to burden their families. They do not want to be a burden. So that is one of the prevailing things. The treatment team has the luxury of not being caught up in those dynamics. As a therapist, I can stand clear of the whole dynamic of love, right? You're not burdening me, and I don't have to convince you of that. We are talking treatment, and I stand there holding possibility. As a therapist, I have the luxury of not getting caught in family dynamics. We have a contract, me and the client. So the client at some point realizes they are not a burden to me. We are in a contract of treatment. So it is my role as a therapist to then hold possibility. And I can hold possibility for a long time. I start with holding possibility. I keep on holding possibility, right? So the client at some point, you don't want to burden your family, but you can lean on the treatment team. And the treatment team can stand there holding possibility. And I'm just going to say from experience, it takes time.
It takes time, and those professionals all have to be equipped, aware, and prepared to hold that space for as long as it takes. But the system is not designed to be able to equip them in that way, I don't think.
A thought came to me about holding space and standing there. We're not actually standing there doing nothing. We're not waiting for, the stars to align or the frogs to sing. We're not waiting for that. That developmental piece that I'm talking about, I meet somebody who's 35 years old who is stuck at 14 when the eating disorder started. And whatever was going on, I pulled the brakes. I could not allow things to go forward as they were because I did not feel prepared. And a part of me is still stuck at 14 and waiting. So there is a growing up process that I am fostering as a therapist while we seemingly were waiting, so weight-wise and body-wise, maybe you don't make a lot of progress and it seems like Maddie has plateaued and she has decided not to recover. But in the therapy room, in the hundreds of hours that you spend in the therapy room, it is a very active process, which at some point leads to a tipping point when Maddie starts catching up with her 34-year-old self or 33-year-old self, whatever, and then says, oh, I couldn't when I was 14. I can at 33.
And we don't know when that tipping point is. We never know at what point the critical mass of therapy and insight and self-development work and literally eating food, but we have no idea when all of that is going to percolate, or the life events, or the hitting rock bottoms, or how many rock bottoms you're going to need to hit. All of that contributes to this snowball, which eventually has enough mass to keep itself rolling with momentum. But we never know the day before that's going to happen. You never know when it is. And so cutting yourself off before giving yourself the full chance to reach that tipping point is a crime, is an absolute crime.
And I think you can speak to that, right? When I hear you speaking, I'm like 100%. Like you can speak to that, as many other clients who have recovered, who had severe eating disorder, severe anorexia, and OCD for the longest time, right? This combination that is in these papers of anorexia and OCD, and work helps that person move along.
Yeah.
It's just scary to think that, and even as I say this, I think about those clients and their families, and I think it is kind of scary to be the family of that person who, apparently the person chose the option, but it's very hard for me to believe that when I think about suggestion.
Yeah.
it is kind of scary to be that family or that person.
They don't know what to do. And I think that many, including families, including professionals, have a very mistaken belief that eating disorders are meant as this slow, drawn-out form of suicide, and that we are actually trying to starve ourselves to death. Nothing could be further from the truth. Eating disorders are a way to keep ourselves safe and alive,
Yes.
not in order to kill ourselves. I realize how difficult that would be for someone to believe who doesn't work with people with eating disorders and has never had one themselves. We don't actually want to die. I think people on the outside that don't understand eating disorders, have never had an eating disorder, may be in the position to say, well, they're trying to starve themselves to death. They're going to die because they are choosing this as a method of suicide. And that is such a misconstrual of what the purpose of an eating disorder is, because eating disorders are not a method for actually killing yourself. We're not actually trying to die. Even in the darkest moments where you're like, boy, I wish that I had relief from this. I wish I just wouldn't wake up, which is a thought that I have had.
Yeah.
It was never about, I want to die. It was only about, I just don't want to do this anymore, which is indeed the opposite of wanting to die. It's wanting to recover.
Yes. And what people are saying is, I don't know how to live my life another way. I am afraid to let it go because I won't have another thing. And, one has to complete the sentence and say, for what? What is the eating disorder doing for you? In trying to understand an eating disorder, people are like, sometimes a person will say, I was sexually assaulted when I was 15. And it seems like, for the rest of us who want something concrete to understand this, it's like, that must be it. Or something must have happened. That is for people who want, you want something concrete to understand. Now, I can say that if you really understand it, most eating disorders, almost all eating disorders, start in early teenage. And I have found it easy to understand this through a developmental lens. So developmentally, I am growing into adulthood, which is responsibility, expectations. It is not freedom, contrary to what we think or what small children think. It is actually a lot of expectations and responsibility. I feel unprepared for that. Emotionally, not intelligence-wise. Maybe I am very smart. Maybe I am, I'm in med school. But emotionally, I feel unprepared for so many reasons. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons here. But again, that is, soundly, firmly standing in theory. So the person feels unprepared, and they are going to make their world small and manageable. Right? And I know that is a difficult concept to understand, but I'm going to go out into the world. I'm going to pretend to be really competent. I'm going to come back home, and now my world is going to shrink. So I isolate. I do not socialize because there is only so much pretending I can do. And then my plate is going to be in counting my number of carrots, my number of calories, weighing myself, making sure that my weight doesn't change, keeping my body really small. The word small is the definition for what goes on behind the scene. Mm-hmm. Even when a person has bulimia and they might not look as small as an anorexic, they are trying to keep that world really small and manageable. And that is a feeling. That is in the emotional realm, right? That is a feeling in the body. I am trying to make my feelings manageable and not very complicated. I cannot live in the real world with all my feelings because I cannot tolerate it in my body. And that is the part of treatment that we're working on behind the scenes. While that work is going on, if someone comes in with a suggestion of, well, you don't, maybe you won't recover, maybe you're never going to learn how to deal with your feelings, maybe life is always going to feel so terrible, so you have a right to take yourself out. If I feel miserable enough, I'm going to say, I don't want to die, but I don't know another way.
I think that the additional conflation that happens along this line is viewing eating disorders as this like slow, methodical suicide when it is indeed a survival mechanism, and that making your life as small as possible and as manageable as possible is the survival mechanism. I would liken an eating disorder more accurately to self-harm, because people who continuously self-harm in other ways, they're not trying to kill themselves. If they wanted to kill themselves, they would.
They aren't trying to
and
cope.
so would anorexics.
Yeah.
If we wanted to kill ourselves, we would know how. We would be able to figure that out. But we don't, because all of this is actually just to cope with being alive. And in order for us to actually help people, we have to believe for them that they can recover until they can believe it for themselves. And we need to get off this sort of harm reduction as a method of treatment because it's lazy. And my concerns about this like infiltration of the harm reduction model being capitalized on for the treatment of eating disorders is something that I've seen for years now. And from the minute that my ears perked up and heard it, sort of in the rumblings of social media and recovery spaces online, I was like, this is a huge, huge problem. First of all, you're not reducing harm by having somebody just get to keep their eating disorder. Eating disorders are inherently incredibly harmful and indeed lethal when taken to their end.
Yes.
Additionally, giving people the tools through harm reduction to keep themselves alive and managing their eating disorder are not tools that they don't already have. We know how to live in the world with our eating disorders. We know how to be even high functioning and keep our eating disorders. We, the anorexics, the eating disorder people, could be teaching classes on how to keep your eating disorder and thrive in the real world and manage in society with your eating disorder alongside you. We already know that, babe. We don't need to be trained on that. We don't need to be therapized on how to keep our eating disorder. It's what we've already been doing for years and years and years. And so to call that a layer or a type or a path or a pillar of treatment is so incredibly misguided and counterintuitive to me. I can't even begin.
Yeah. And I don't know, actually, when you say harm reduction, I don't know what that conversation would be. It brings me, which I'm not going to go into this time, but it brings me to the topic of, what do we do, right? But when I think about it, one of the thoughts I have is, as a therapist, I spend hundreds of hours sitting with a client. And this tendency of institutions, right? So what we're not talking about is everything is controlled by a budget. So eating disorder treatment gets pretty expensive because it's over a number of years. Institutions have budgets. And so they start measuring, so we're in this phase of outcome-based brief therapy, and we have to put numbers to things. So strategies and models have become very, everyone likes them because there is a book and there are pages that you can photocopy and give to a client. And then clients have big binders sitting in their house that they never use.
I have so many.
And they
say, so many pages.
And they say, yeah, I know all the skills, but it's not useful in the moment. So then you're supposed to, the therapist starts turning the screw harder and saying, no, you have to use the skills, or now you're going to be a resistant client or not motivated. But when I think about what do you do, there are these amorphous things like, therapists have to know theories. They have to have a philosophical underpinning to this. Not airy-fairy, pretty concrete. And strategies and models are the action part of a theory. Therapists have to be willing to be creative. Therapists have to always think in context, not just looking at Maddie, but looking at, her developmental context, her structural context, the family, and all of it. A therapist has to have, I'm going to say like a good carpenter, like 350 tools in your belt. You can't come to the room with 2 tools. And, nowadays I think about manuals and I think the manual is more for the therapist than the client. Here is a manual of skills that you can practice with your client in the room. Don't photocopy a sheet and give it to them, because the client likes paper more than anything else. They're not going to do anything with it. But, a paper is very comforting to the therapist and the client. It does not get put into practice.
No.
It has to be practiced in the room because it is co-regulation.
And I think, and what comes to mind for me when you're talking is that I think that two things can be true in this. And the people that I think that are proponents of the harm reduction model, and maybe what they think that they're doing, is meeting someone where they're at.
Yes.
And I've heard this before. And I actually think that meeting someone where they're at is entirely important and critical in the therapeutic relationship. But meeting someone where they're at and staying there.
Yes.
And believing that this person can't move anywhere except for there is where you lose me. So I think that this whole, I just think that the good intention about meeting someone where they already feel hopeless and letting them be there for a while is okay, but stop calling that harm reduction. You're not reducing harm by not walking your client out of their eating disorder and into recovery. Maintenance of an eating disorder is inherently harmful.
To that, Maddie, it's like I can meet you where you're at, and then I'm saying, I don't know where to go from here. So that's not helpful.
No, the therapist has to know where we're going from here. They've got the map.
The therapist must have the map.
The therapist must have the map.
So when I talk about theory, the models, the problem with the models is the model is kind of saying you don't need to know anything more. This is all you need to know. Here are the tools. It's like me giving you a chainsaw and saying, here is the tool, but there's no background of carpentry, and I'm going to give you a tool. And you're like, okay, but I don't, we don't have any context to this. So meeting someone where they're at, absolutely. And, right? I meet you where you're at, and I have a torch. I have a map. It is a forest. I know which way we're going. And, maybe we'll sit down here for some time. Then we'll get up and walk a bit. Then we'll sit down again. Then we'll get up and walk a bit. So there are some of the things I tell clients, right? I say, when you make a piece of progress, we're going to try to keep it. You're not going to take a bite of a bagel and then never eat a bagel again.
Once it's in, it's in.
It's not, this is kind of the difference between, oh, she ate a muffin, how exciting. And then she never eats a muffin again, right? There are some things to what we call treatment and, meeting someone where they're at. And then if I'm the client, I look at my therapist, and it would be nice for me to know that she knows which way we're going, because I certainly don't, right? So I don't know the meaning of what I'm saying. I don't know why I have an eating disorder. I just know what I'm doing in desperation.
Yeah.
In my desperate attempt to manage life as I know it. It is my attempt to live.
So what I'm hearing in terms of now what, so what, how do we actually do this then? Because it's not MAID.
No.
Because you can't just improve the rates of eating disorders by killing the people that have eating disorders and being like, oh, look, the number went down. That's not going to do it.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like equipping professionals in this field in a way that they can tolerate a little bit of patience and uncertainty of themselves, but seeing it through and believing and knowing that indeed this is possible, that recovery is possible. That's what I'm hearing is pretty much the only option we have.
And you know what? If you don't know what to do, that's okay. Refer them to somebody else.
How much humility would that take, right? I think that's a bit of a human problem.
I mean, knowing your limitation, parents knowing their limitations, and I say that as a parent, therapists knowing their limitations, doctors knowing their limitations, professionals' capacity to say, oh, I think I've hit my limit. I'm going to refer this person to somebody else.
Yeah.
It is not mercy to offer. I think this is mercy. People think it's merciful. You're suffering. I am going to offer you mercy. I don't think it is.
No.
I think it is a lack of knowledge. I don't think it's mercy.
It's not mercy, and construing it as mercy is insane. I think
It's dangerous.
It's dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous, and it's so backwards to what we're actually trying to do. And something that I've thought about when I've been reflecting on this as well is my own, I don't want to say bias, but my own leaning towards liberty, let's call it, right? Because I do think that people should have the liberty to do what they want insofar as it's not harming other people. However, as you mentioned, the power of suggestion, I don't believe that this is actually what people want. And guiding them and nudging them towards something like this, the most extreme thing you can ever do is take your own life.
Yeah. And it is permanent.
There is no going back from this.
It is permanent.
And we casually write this into policy, further and further expanding the bounds of what it means to be irreparably damaged, irreparably ill, terminal. That the definition of that has had such scope creep.
There is something terribly wrong in this, because that idea of do no harm, this is harm. It is.
Yeah.
And as we're sitting here and talking, I'll say one more thing, Maddie, about my relationship to MAID. And I've said this before. When I was 19, my mother had cancer, and she was given too much radiation. So the left side of her body got completely burnt through. They did not know what to do. This was 1984 in India. They did not know what to do. She was at home. I became her nurse. She was 48. I was 19. There was a hole in her shoulder, and there was like the burnt flesh was coming out, and I had to figure it out what to do and be incredibly creative about it. There was a time my mother said, this was all in 10 months. There was one day my mother said, if I could get up and kill myself, I would, because she was in that much pain.
Yeah.
She was living inside her burnt body. If she had asked me to help her, I would do it, because there was no coming back. I didn't know she was dying, but she was.
Yeah.
So I understand MAID. I do. There are places where I think it is appropriate. And so this is not a blanket, we think MAID is wrong and we're very righteous about it. I do think suggesting this to someone who could possibly recover, if the suggestion was right, is doing harm.
I completely agree. I completely agree with you. I completely agree that there is a place for medically assisted suicide. I think when we start considering things as terminal that are not, because yes, if untreated, anorexia will be terminal in some way, shape, or form, right? It'll either shorten your life or it'll decrease the quality of your life so substantially that it might as well be shorter. And there are other things that are like that as well, where they are not terminal, but they are, like, poverty is not terminal,
right?
But they started allowing people to use medical assistance in dying that are basically just depressed because they are in poverty. Poverty is not terminal unless it is untreated by good policy. Anorexia is not terminal unless untreated as a result of bad policy and care.
And the age proposed is 30.
Oh my God,
I have a 50-year-old client who has decided to recover.
I know.
So
I know.
I'm like, this is craziness.
You never know the day before you're going to decide to recover. And stripping people of that possibility through the power of suggestibility, through professionals that are supposed to be taking care of them, is unconscionable. Period. So Lakshmi, we've got a letter to write and an article to write in defense of this position, but it's been wonderful talking it through on this episode. And thank you again for being here.
And I'm happy for an opportunity to talk about it and put it out there so people can listen. I worry about who's going to hear what argument and what decisions are going to be made.
Yeah. What decisions are going to be made, indeed. All right. We will see you soon.